You can tell I've not graded any papers yet. They're cheering.
Right, right. Well, thank you so much for being at Penn and being such a friend of Penn and Philadelphia. And we're going to have a conversation and then open it up for questions, which I have from the audience. But I thought I would begin with one quick question, okay? There's a big upcoming event that's on a lot of people's minds, especially Americans. And so I thought I would ask you about the Academy Awards this Sunday. And seriously, as you would say, seriously, you're a friend of Philadelphia, and a lesser-known fact is that Bradley Cooper is a native of Philadelphia. I've also spent a little time with him because he's a big Eagles fan, so we've watched Eagles games together. And you, I understand, are a friend of Lady Gaga. So, not to prejudice this in any way, but the quick question is, do you have a favorite in the upcoming Academy Awards on Sunday?
Cooper and Gaga. I mean, it's simple. Look, I know Bradley not well, and I don't
know him well either, but I know him.
No, but all kidding aside, I spent some time with him because after he did Silver Linings Playbook, I spent some time with him because one of the things I worked on as vice president was trying to erase the stigma of mental illness and seeking help for mental illness because we have so many veterans coming home suffering from post-traumatic stress. We have, I carry with me, I won't go through it, but I carry with me a card that lists every single solitary person who has died or been injured in the wars since in Afghanistan and Iraq. But what is not listed there is close to 300,000 have come home with post-traumatic stress and serious cases of post-traumatic stress. And what he did was he made it more acceptable in that art is a precursor to the change that takes place in society. And he made it more acceptable for these women and men to go seek help in that movie. And then Lady Gaga and I became friends because she has worked with me very closely on dealing with violence against women and the abuse of women in American society. And she asked me to introduce her at the Academy Awards when she was nominated for Till It Happens to You. The song was nominated for the Academy Award. And I introduced her, and she had with her 40 young women and men, all of whom I spent time with, who were victims of abuse. And about half of them, as they walked out on the stage, their parents had no idea they had been victimized, had been sexually abused. And she had spent a lot of time with me talking about her own struggle overcoming the abuse that she suffered. She never talked about it very much before. But she's had the courage to come forward and talk about the victimization and the consequences. When I wrote the Violence Against Women Act, Madam President, when I wrote the Violence Against Women Act, I said at the time, and the Congresswoman might remember this, is that I said I thought that women who were abused, particularly by someone they knew, were victims of post-traumatic stress. I had no proof of it at the time. That was my instinct. And since then, the CDC and other organizations have come out and established that 30% of all women who have been abused suffer from post-traumatic stress and serious long-term immune. The CDC laid out the number of women who suffer from immune disorders as a consequence. They have higher rates of heart attack, they have higher rates of high blood pressure, and so on and so forth. And so her willingness to come out and be vocal about that and say, this is what I went through, matters. It matters to help a number of girls and women who have been abused. And so we've worked very hard, and we continue to work together to deal with increasing the number of, in the violence against women area, the number of mental abuse facilities that are available for women who've been victimized. So and we're friends, we stay in touch, and she continues to help me in this thing which my father used to say. He said, for real, that the greatest sin of all was abuse of power, and the cardinal sin was a man to raise his hand to a woman or a child. And she's a very major force. And when I introduced her, there were 200 million hits on our site the night I introduced her. 200 million people worldwide watched. So art matters a lot.
Here, here. And Shallow is a shoo-in, so we agree on that as well. Let me ask you.
I'm not a good handicapper, but
right.
I believe you. I'm for it.
So now a bigger question. You've just come back from Munich, the Munich Security Conference. And as I followed that conference in the press, it was remarkable to hear that multilateralism is at risk in our world. And so I wonder if you would tell us what you came away from that conference thinking about where we are and what the future, near future, medium future holds for multilateralism.
Well, folks,
and you might want to explain to everybody what multilateralism is.
Well, look, we have, in American history, I think, reached certain places I call inflection points, where fundamental change is going to take place in one direction or another, and we still have the ability to control the change that takes place. And we reached an inflection point. After World War II, your great-grandparents, my grandparents, and my parents' generation put together the greatest structure of preventing the overall abuse of power that ever occurred, so that we wouldn't have a replication of the two world wars in the 20th century. And they were NATO, which was designed to prevent any one country from being able to abuse its power independently by forming this most significant alliance in all of human history, number one. Number two was setting up a thing called the European Union. The European Union was a way to prevent the breakdown of democratic institutions within Europe that had occurred in the past because of economic dislocation that occurs, and essentially writing a commerce clause for Europe. That's what it was about. And now both of those, for the first time in 70 years, are under attack. I'll just say, is under attack by an administration that views the EU as a problem and rooting for its demise, which is the dumbest thing in the world. I mean it seriously, because it's about sustaining democratic institutions. That's what this is about. That's why it came about. And NATO, they've had this conference used to call the Vergunda Conference. Now it's called the Munich Security Conference. It's been going on for 54 years. I've attended it since I was a 32-year-old United States Senator on the Foreign Relations Committee. This is the first time the question before the House, this is all the leaders of NATO, the heads of state and foreign ministers and the most significant people in those countries. The title was, "Who will pick up the pieces?" That was the question before the alliance. Who will pick up the pieces? Russia is having a profound impact on basically their objective of the disillusionment of a Europe whole, free, and at peace. It's all been built around the idea of this unity, both economic and political, and military unity. And so what happened was, just the morning before I got there, Angela Merkel, who is freed from the leadership of her party now, gave a speech without notes that was an incredible refutation of U.S. foreign policy as it relates to NATO. When, the United States Congress passed overwhelmingly with almost 400, House and Senate, almost 400, I forget how many votes that combined that were needed to say we will not leave NATO. President of the United States saying, and the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor talking about unless you pay up, it's not a protection racket. No, but it really isn't. We talk about it that way. We've made a sacred commitment in Article 5. An attack on one is an attack on all. That's what's maintained the peace and security in Europe. And now there's a question going on, whether or not we mean it. Whether we mean it. The Vice President of the United States spoke there, and I know him, I like him, but he spoke on behalf of the President and lectured NATO about their obligations and how they had to break all ties with Iran and how they had to do and dictating to them. When he said, I'm here on behalf of the President of the United States of America, you got the exact same result I just got. Dead silent. No, I'm serious. This is worrisome. It's not about Democrat, Republican. It really isn't. There was a deafening silence. And the conclusion was that the United States cannot be counted on. Cannot be counted on any longer. The transatlantic alliance is the basis upon which we're able to function in the world. It's the platform from which we're able to function. We don't want to be the policeman of the world. We can't be. None of the problems we face that are an incredible consequence in the 21st century lend themselves to one nation being able to solve them. Whether it's stateless terrorism, cybersecurity, a new nuclear arms race, I go down the list. Without there being coordination, cooperation. My dad had another expression, Joey, don't compare me to the Almighty, compare me to the alternative. Well, I spoke and I stood up and I got introduced, I got a standing ovation, not because of me. I was there and there were 50 members of the House and Senate that came. It was important. I don't know that you went back in the days when you were there, but 50 members, Democrat and Republican. And I spoke about the need for multilateral cooperation and why we needed a strong Euro-Atlantic alliance. And instead of talking about who will pick up the pieces, talked about we had to reassert our commitment in the world. 70% of the American people think we should stay engaged in the world. We're being sold as somehow America wants to walk away, not from our obligations alone, but our opportunities. Tell me, name me one consequential problem, from global warming to a nuclear arms race, that can be solved by us alone. Name me one. So this is an inflection point. And I believe those 50 members of the House and Senate, Republicans as many as Democrats, when I talked about NATO and its role and how we had to expand it in a way that was not a formal alliances, but bringing in the Pacific Basin and all that's going on and how we have to deal with an expanding and juggernaut called China and a completely disruptive policy run by Putin. I got a standing ovation from Democratic and Republican members, back to the whole audience, but led by the United States delegation. So folks, this is a really critical moment. A really critical moment for your generation. And I think we are going to be able to sustain, save, and expand the security that's built around NATO. because that's where I think the American people are, not where this administration is.
So let me ask you a follow-up question to that, because it is striking, and you and I were talking about this earlier, that often it's said that Americans don't pay that much attention when we're not at a war with international affairs and international politics. But that's really changed. And you wrote recently, befitting your professorship, you wrote an article in America's Quarterly, quite aptly entitled, strikingly entitled, "The Western Hemisphere Needs U.S. Leadership." So what do you want people to take away from that? Why do you think it's so important now? After all, we're not in a war. The U.S. doesn't feel, most Americans don't feel, rightly or wrongly, you can say, threatened by the big powers, including the powers that have been traditionally considered our enemies. Why does the Western Hemisphere need U.S. leadership, and what would you like Americans to take away from that piece that you wrote?
Everything we've done in the 20th century, and with some success and some failures, and in this century, has been designed to increase democratic representation for a basic reason. Democratic countries usually don't go to war with other democratic countries. And the reason they're able to sustain their democracy is they're able to respond to the economic and political needs of their citizens. And so there's not as much disruption at home. That's what democracies are about. And I made a speech several years ago that got a lot of critical comment, some good and some not so good, saying that you look at the Western Hemisphere, there's no reason why over the next 20 years it can't become the epicenter of innovation, cooperation, and growth in the entire world, from the Arctic to the Antarctic. To have an entire area that is democratic, free, and functioning in terms of its economic system. But one of the things you take a look out there, there's more people in flux, more migrants today than any time since World War II. More. Look at the dislocation and the political unrest that is generated in Europe. Brexit being the most obvious example. But look what's happening throughout Europe. Look what's happening in Hungary. Look what's happening in states that were democratic states brought into NATO. And now you have Orban, who is essentially well, he's not a very good guy in Hungary. And so if you take a look at what the hysteria going on now about the southern border, there's a simple reason, folks, why it's in our interest to deal with that. And what's the best way to deal with that? People tend not to leave home if when they're home they like where they're living. People tend not to leave if they're able to make a living, if the corruption does not exist on a rampant scale, if they have an education system that functions, an economy that functions. So as vice president, the president gave me the authority to set, I laid out that the third most critical foreign policy initiative we had was to deal with the Northern Triangle. And the Northern Triangle being Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. Massive inflow of people trying to make it to the border. Why are they leaving? Because of corruption, because of the gangs that rule in those areas, because of the fact that the economy in Guatemala, entire sections of the country have no electricity. You can't turn a switch, even though they have access to energy and so on. And so in a bipartisan way, we put together over a $700 million plan with very precise requirements that had to be met by the country in question in order to get the assistance that they were asking for to begin to modernize their society, clean up their police forces. For example, if I have it correctly, I'm checking this to make sure I give you I don't know, I can't find it now, but the exact number of people who were, for example, we went down and helped them clean up their police departments. And we went down like we did in Colombia years earlier in Plan Colombia. And we were able to purge, as a consequence of the implementation of the corruption in Honduras, 1,000 police officers fired. They were part of organized crime. They were part of a corrupt system. We were able to, and the condition was, you want our assistance, then you let us come in and help you clean up your law enforcement. In El Salvador, we put together a task force that where 21 officers and one dedicated prosecutor who focused on extortion. And they found out 169 individuals were being investigated in their intelligence community and in their organized crime units. So to get the money, they had to clean up. So we tied this aid specifically to changing the circumstances in the countries in which they are coming from. Last point I'll make. If you notice, the last several years, immigration from Mexico is way down. From Mexico, of Mexicans. Why? Because the Mexican economy is significantly up. Because we helped them put together the change in their oil industry and a number of other things. There's still corruption, but it's significantly changed the circumstances. So people decided, I don't want to leave Mexico. I'm doing much better. There's some hope in my country. People leave when there's no hope. When there's no hope. So if we're going to deal with the unsettling political consequences of immigration, the ability of some leaders to demagogue it, what we should have done is followed through on this commitment, which was bipartisan. John McCain, Lindsey Graham, a whole range of people joined me as vice president in putting together this effort for this $760 million, I should say, to change the circumstances on the ground. Well, this president came along and essentially let it all blow up. For example, you know, we're all this thing about seeking asylum. We set it up so you could seek asylum in an embassy in country. Now, if you didn't want people coming to the border, why would you eliminate that possibility for your case to be adjudicated in country? It's about xenophobia. This is not healthy. And we have to reinstate this notion of helping. It's in our naked self-interest, and to be overstated in the interest of time. I'm sure now I fully understand my grandfather and father better when, after millions of people were killed in World War II, we came along, and while we still had over 300,000 troops there, and tens of thousands of Americans, 100,000 killed, and said, we're going to rebuild Europe. Tell me how well off you'd all be had we not rebuilt Europe. It was overwhelmingly in our self-interest to do that. It's still in our self-interest. The payback is multifold.
Thanks.
I don't feel passionately about any of this. It just drives me nuts.
Passion connected with empathy is a really good thing. So thank you for that. The Penn-Biden Center for Diplomacy and Global Engagement has as a core commitment the maintaining and strengthening of global connections and relationships and the education of our students for that. And that combines with our Perry World House right here on campus, and we have a Penn Wharton China Center in Beijing, all of which are, as our students very well know and our faculty know, are really committed to strengthening global connectedness. And most recently, you and I just met a few minutes ago with a group of Penn students who went, sponsored by the Penn-Biden Center, went to Japan on the Kakahachi project and spent some time learning about cultural translation, if you will. Why is that so important, both educationally and to our country? Because we're not particularly good. I mean, we teach lots of languages here at Penn, but as a country, we're renowned for overwhelmingly speaking English. Now more and more Spanish is being spoken. But why is cultural connectedness, in your mind, so important and such a core commitment of the Penn-Biden Center?
The biggest and most important thing is to avoid misunderstanding. The only war worse than one that's intended is one that's unintended. The only disagreement worse than one that's intended is one that was a misunderstanding. There was no reason for it to occur. Barack, the president, is always joking with me because I've constantly said repeated to him half a dozen sayings to remind him constantly of my view of what we should do. And I always would say, and he'll say today, as Joe says, all politics is personal. All international relations is personal. It's important to understand the other individual and the leaders of other countries, to be able to make hard assessments of whether they mean what they say and what their limitations are, what they are capable of doing, what they're not capable of doing. As I mentioned once before, I got criticized because when I was doing regional arms control related to missile defense in Europe, meeting with Putin in Russia, after a 5-hour meeting, he asked me to go into his, with our national security teams. And he asked me to come and show me his office. He showed me his office in Dodge. And I joked and I put my arms up. I said, "Isn't it amazing what capitalism will do?" And it was a beautiful, beautiful office. And as I turned around, I found myself looking at him. I was joking, turning like this. And I only had an interpreter, and he had a simultaneous interpretation. And I was looking into his eyes, and I said, "Mr. President, I'm looking in your eyes, and I don't think you have a soul." And he looked back at me and said, "We understand each other." It wasn't being a wise guy. It was about laying down clearly what each of our perspectives was. There's no misunderstanding. No misunderstanding. And it works the other way. A lot of the concern we have that really exists in other parts of the world are unfounded. Some are very well founded. And you have to figure out what is the most likely thing that can bring about some sort of cooperation. I was impressed with the students. We asked them, you asked them each to give their impression of the trip. Every one of them said something along the lines of, "I have a better understanding now. I didn't realize there was such, I didn't speak the language. They didn't speak the language, our host. But I was amazed at how we were able to actually communicate. How, you know, the one example I was given, 2 students stayed in a village outside of Hiroshima, and they didn't speak English at all, but through using what app was it you used to translate from English to Spanish? Well, and they said a person.
There's an app for everything.
There's a host who said, he showed him a leaf that was withering, yeah. And he said, "How can your leaders think there's not global warming?" And so, yeah. There's much of the world has become so small that we have so many common interests that transcend borders and transcend ideology that we have to be able to work together. But the first thing is to get to know the other person, get to know the other country, understand what its cultural biases are and its cultural instincts are. That's the only way to get to a place where they can have the kind of cooperation that we need in order to be able to keep this world from being engaged in major international conflict and provide for a constant increase in the standard of living of the world as a whole. It's important in our own naked self-interest to do so.
So we've spoken about America in the world. I think it's really important for me to ask you a few questions about America here at home. And before or at the same time as we're concerned about leadership in the world, surely we have to be concerned about getting our own house in order. What do you think the first steps are in your mind, unless you think our house is in perfect order? What do you happen to think some of the first steps would be to getting our own house in better order?
Well, folks, I think there's an emerging bipartisan consensus. At least 70% of the American people have arrived at the conclusion with different answers about the House out of order. Most Americans think our House is out of order, maybe for different reasons, offering different solutions. But it's not the America that we thought. After Charlottesville, I wrote a piece for the Atlantic magazine. And I said, we're in a fight for America's soul, the soul of America. David Brooks, who is, I think, a very conservative guy, but I think he's a very enlightened columnist, talked about there's an invisible moral fabric that holds up all societies, including ours. And it's being rended, it's being ripped apart. Basic fundamental values that are shared by all Americans. Fairness, decency, honesty, truth making a difference. The whole idea of dealing with that you had, these folks coming out of dark fields carrying torches, chanting the same anti-Semitic bile that was chanted in the streets of Nuremberg, Berlin, and Munich in the 30s. Literally, not figuratively, literally the same exact language, carrying swastikas, being accompanied by white supremacists, and confronted by wholesome Americans who thought this is not who we are. We are not racist. We are not anti-Semites. We are not homophobic. It's not who we are. And then the highest leaders, particularly coming from the alt-right, saying there was a moral equivalence. Good people in both groups. My God. Not a joke. Think about it. No president since the Civil War has ever uttered anything remotely approaching words like that. So it's time to restore America's soul. Remind ourselves who we are. And secondly, to deal with some of the byproducts. There's a reason why George Will talks about, when he spoke at the Constitution Center, where you are on the board and you're a major player, he talked about the reason for this approach by the alt-right is to make space for the abuse of power. Blame whatever the problem is that you have as a consequence of a transition taking place in society economically with a fourth industrial revolution on the other. The problem is that immigrant, that black, that woman getting an advantage, that so on and so forth. And the end result of all of that is it makes space for the abuse of power. And we're seeing that now. And one of the things we have to deal with the reality of a changing economy. It's happened on at least 4 occasions in the last, since the early 1800s. We're in the middle of a fourth industrial revolution. Digitalization, artificial intelligence, and so on. The question is, and it's a genuine question being written about here at this great university, will there be a middle class? Will there be a middle class? Not because of bad people, because of fundamental changes taking place. Remember when you were in undergraduate school, in high school, and you learned about the Luddites wandering the Midlands of England in the early 1800s, smashing the machinery? Because was causing the entire breakdown of the social structure of England that had been in place for the previous 300 years. Well, we had roughly two, I'm going to give you a raw number, 200,000 jobs about 18 months ago that were in retail sales. They're all gone. Those roughly 200,000. Roughly average age of the person holding the job, 50 years old. Roughly average salary, $50,000 a year. So everything from Saks Fifth Avenue outlet to Benetton to, that shoe place, whatever, Payless or whatever it's called. Well, why are they gone?
They all know.
Thing called Amazon. Not bad guys. Not bad guys. But guess what? Now you're 50 years old. You're a $50,000 contributor to the income of your family. You've got several kids. You're high school educated, and where do you go? What happens to you? And so there's a lot of people justifiably worried, and we have a lot of answers, but we're not speaking to these people. We're not speaking to this middle class that is scared to death about the changes that are coming forward. There's a lot of things we can do. Everything from dealing with the tax structure to deal with education, to deal with continuing education, a whole range of things. But we've got to respond. We've got to respond.
So some people here have their eyes set already on the 2020 election. And
I don't know who that is.
But more recently, there's been an election, just saying, you know. Most recently, there's been an election in 2018, and you campaigned for a lot of candidates. You were on the road a lot. And I think it's really important for us. We all live in bubbles. You were out there on the road. You met a lot of people. You spoke and heard from a lot of people. If you would tell us something about what you came away from that's most striking to you, that you heard when you were on the road. We asked our students just a few moments ago what was most striking to them in Japan. What was most striking to you out on the road in America, campaigning for others? What impression did it most strikingly leave you with, if you could share that with us?
I'll try to be as brief as I can. Only 7 minutes they tell me left. What my Penn graduate son, Bo, used to talk about is that you have to be on the ground and listen. Part of being an elected official is listening. And when he was dying, I decided I wasn't going to run for president. And afterwards, I committed with the President of the United States that I would spend the next 2 years doing whatever I could to elect Democratic members of the House of Representatives and governors. Because gerrymandering is a serious sin going on right now in our system, distorting it. And the governors in 2020 will be the ones making a judgment on reapportionment. And the House, I believe we could win back. I made the unwise, which is typical of me, prediction that we would win over 40 votes to take back the House. Thank God we did, or I would never heard the end of it. So I went into 65 races in 25 states. And here's what I found. Number one, no matter it was a Democrat or a Republican district, the people in the district were looking for people of character. Just simply people of character. It was higher on the agenda than any particular issue. Character. Did they mean what they say? Were they authentic? Did they understand my problem? Were they, in fact, concerned about me? Did they see me? Do you see me? Do you see me? The second thing I found was that it affected particularly working class and middle class people on the things that fundamentally affect their lives that have changed so drastically. Are they going to have access to health care? It was a gigantic issue. There was somebody who said it was a big friggin' deal when the Affordable Care Act passed. I don't know who it was, but it was a big deal. The more people learned why they had the insurance they had, they didn't know. They didn't realize that you could stay in your parents' policy till you're 26 because of the Affordable Care Act, that you could not be penalized for having a pre-existing condition and be denied insurance, and so on. So it became a gigantic issue, health care. But it goes beyond health care. What it was all about is peace of mind. All people are looking for is some sense and notion that they're going to be able to take care of their family. My dad's expression, we moved down from Scranton, and if you listen to Barack, you'd think I climbed out of a coal mine with a lunch bucket in my hand. But my dad was a white-collar, high school educated, well-read man, but he had an expression from the time we moved to Delaware. He'd say, Joey, remember, a job's about a lot more than a paycheck. It's about your dignity. It's about self-respect. It's about your place in the community. It's about your sense of who you are. It's about being able to look your kid in the eye and say, honey, it's going to be okay. And mean it. Mean it. Well, so many people don't believe that anymore. Fewer than 50% of the American people qualify themselves as middle class now. And they're worried. But they're easy answers.
I think that's the first time ever in
I think it's the first time
American
at least
history.
recorded history that that's the case. A lot of your parents, and many of you are here like my kids originally got here, but many of you are here come from middle-class backgrounds. Others of you come from wealthy families. But you know, those of you who come from middle-class or working-class backgrounds and you're getting assistance to get here, you know the struggles at home. You know what people are worried about. They're worried about, well, I used to get our arguments in the administration. One of the few disagreements we'd have privately was that I believe that the vast majority of middle-class people could not go a month without a paycheck. They would be bankrupt. Well, guess what? 60% can't. Recent studies show that a $400 bill all of a sudden appearing in 1 month, most 40% of the families can't handle that. And so there's no excuse for this. Because there's more dislocation and separation in income with the top 1% and the top 1/10 of 1% than all the rest of the population since prior to 1920. And it's sort of crept in. We made it more difficult for people to compete for their own self-worth. Forget unions, which I'm a strong supporter of. I know the Wharton School guys won't like that much, but I am. I think they built the middle class, by the way. But having said that, take a look. Look at all the impediments put in the way of you to be able to negotiate for your own self-worth. You go out and work for any of the Fortune 500 companies. 21% of you will go to a company, have to sign a contract, say you will not discuss your pay with anyone else. What possible reason for that can be other than suppressing wages? Give me one explanation for other than that. You find out 40% of you, 40% of the people today have to sign a non-compete agreement. A significant number of those are hourly workers. Why can someone making sandwiches at Jimmy John's not go compete for a job with McDonald's and get 40 cents more an hour, have to sign a non-compete agreement? Tell me what possible rationale there is for that that's crept into American economic system. Tell me whether or not the ability to maintain an occupation requires the licensing of 1,000 hours to learn how to braid hair. Seriously. Tell me, what's that all about other than suppressing wages? So we got to change our mindset here. I'm not talking about a fundamental, I'm talking about going back to what we used to do in large part. I'll conclude by saying I got a call from a number of 6 of the Fortune top 20 CEOs, including a guy who manages several $1 trillion under a contract called Blackstone. And they came to see me in the White House. And the head of them was a former governor of Michigan named Engler, who was the head of the Business Roundtable, the largest corporations in the world. You know what they wanted my help on? Reestablishing a corporate culture that is competitive, that's not built on short-termism. Let me give you an example, guys. I have in my office, in your offices now, Penn offices in Washington, D.C., which I hope you'll come and visit, you students. It's really quite impressive. And we have a lot of interchange on Capitol Hill and people coming down. It's all designed to give you access to power, access to people with power. And I have a cartoon that I had for the last 7 years. My staff used to take it off the mantelpiece in the vice president's office, and I'd put it back up. There's a picture of a guy, a big rotund guy in a black turtleneck sweater with a black mask, a black beret, and a big bag on the table with a dollar sign. It's from the New Yorker magazine. Mm-hmm. And there's a conference table, and his interrogator's on the same side of the table, like you and I looking at each other. And he's looking at the interrogator and he's saying, how was I supposed to know he was a job creator? Guys, since when at the Wharton School or any other school, as my mother would say, who died and left the stockholder's boss? When were they the only job creators? What happened to a moral responsibility, to a moral capitalism that is designed to understand your employees are job creators? The community that builds a $20 million exchange to get into your factory is a job creator. Everybody is involved. And what's happening now is you have leaders in the community, corporate leaders, talking about ending short-termism. Because what's happening, guys? I'll end with an example. General Motors, good company. Now, if you go back and Google it, you'll find that I was the leading effort in the administration to, quote, bail out General Motors. Even 56% of the Democrats didn't think we should do it. But it was an iconic industry, and I was convinced that we could compete. And what happened was the auto workers gave up a great deal to get the job, and stockholders gave up some. We lent them money. They came out of bankruptcy, paid every penny back with interest. And the first year out, they made $7 billion in profit. What did they do with most of it? They didn't invest in new plant and equipment. They didn't start focusing on electric vehicles like they know they have to. They made management decisions that continued to not change, and they bought back their stock, increasing their own value, because that's where 90% of all the pay comes now for CEOs and executives is from stock. I think it's 90. Someone from Wharton can tell me maybe 87 or 92, but it's roughly 90. And guess what? No investment in worker training and modernizing. And then we passed this god-awful tax bill, which even conservative think tanks are now acknowledging did not do anything approaching what was expected, but it did create a $1.9 trillion additional deficit. So now we have, there's a cartoon today in the New Yorker, a picture of a guy, there's a great big dragon, and it says $17 trillion in debt. I think it's 17. And Uncle Sam has his hands up on a railroad track, and he's being pushed up by, he said, well, it's only important when there's a Democratic president. But think about it, guys. What has it done? So they got about $194 million in a tax break, General Motors. But they made a correct business decision. I'm not being facetious. There are 4 products that aren't selling. And they're going to have to go out and they're going to now make major investment in electronic vehicles. Smart decision. But what did they do? They laid off 17,000 workers. They made sure the tax break continued to go to the corporate stockholders instead of giving severance pay for these poor SOBs that have nothing to them. They're talking about building these plants in other countries, and they're not reinvesting here after we bail their rear ends out. I'm not looking for charity. Business is not in business to be a charity. It's to make money. But the last dime does not dictate what corporate responsibility should be. And look, I don't begrudge anybody making $1 million or hundreds of millions of dollars. I really don't. But I do think there's some shared responsibility, and it's not being shared fairly for hard-working, middle-class and working-class people. Anyway.
Thank you. So we're going to segue to questions from members of this wonderful group here. But before we do, I just want to ask a question that relates to your family. Given that I know as much as you love our country and you love the University of Pennsylvania, which is a lot, family always comes first for you, and you have a new member of your family, I'm told, named Major. So tell us a little bit about Major, and then we'll take questions from all of you, which I have right here.
Guys, I've always been a dog. I've always had dogs, and I've always had big dogs.
I'll give you.
And I am. We can start a great discussion here, but I'm extremely partial to German Shepherds, and I don't think anyone should own a big dog unless they are really well behaved. You have to be responsible. And I have
and the owner has to be very well behaved.
Yeah,
right?
The owner has to be well behaved to train the dog. I really mean it. There's no rationale unless you have a dog that can be completely obedient. And so my dog Champ is now getting to be an old guy. He was a gift to me when I didn't want to run for vice president. My family got together and said, "Okay, if you run, you can get a German Shepherd." And I'm not joking. Every time I'd get on the campaign plane, there'd be a picture of a German Shepherd in the bulkhead. And so on Christmas, after we won, my Maisie, who's applying here to go to school, is a great athlete, by the way. She came in. No, by the way, this kid is.
You know I don't do admissions, Mr. Vice President.
No, I'm telling them, you're going to have a hell of a lot better soccer team and lacrosse team if you have her. She's all state. Anyway, she's amazing. That's another thing. My Maisie, she's something else. Anyway, but having said that, and I hope the Dean of Admissions is listening because I'm coming for you. But all kidding aside, she came walking in at Christmas time 10 years ago carrying this little German Shepherd puppy and said, "Pop, we got you a dog." And I said, "What'd you name him?" She said, "We named him Champ." I said, "How'd you name that?" And I said, "They call my father Dada." She said, "Dada always called you Champ when you were little. We thought it'd be a good name for him." But at any rate, so he was trained by the Secret Service and is a great dog. And but he's getting old, and my vet came along and said, to keep him young, if you had another dog, it would help. And it really does. It's added a year or two to his life. And so I got a phone call. My daughter is very involved in Delaware and a lot of good causes. She's a social worker and runs a nonprofit. And she got a call from the Delaware Humane Society.
She's a social worker educated at Penn, right?
Educated at Penn. She got her master's degree here at Penn, the School of Social Work.
Let's hear it for School of Social Policy and Practice.
And to make a long story short, they had a German Shepherd turned in. And it was a rescue dog, so I went down and got it. And they said, "Can we have a picture with you walking out with a dog?" I said, "Sure." I hadn't any idea they posted it, and it got hundreds of thousands of responses. So I go around and said, "How's Major? How's Major?" So Major's doing well, taking care of Champ, but a little rambunctious. A lover, he'll just lick you to death if you see him, but we got to train him a little more.
Okay, that was an interlude. Now to questions from our audience, and if you're here, please stand up. From Ashwini Nagapan? I got it all wrong, I'm sure. A bioethics student, are you here? Okay, there. Why don't you pronounce your first name for me? Ashwini. Okay. As young voters, what important political issues might we overlook but should actually pay more attention to?
Well, look, I think one of the things is that, I think you all get kind of caught up. No, I really mean it. You take out that cell phone and you let it become, communicating becomes a verb. I mean, and you begin to measure yourself against what you see on the internet. And I think that's a very short-sighted way to look at your own interest and the interest of the country. And so the things that you have to, I think, not have to, and worth overlooking, is people who have a different view than you, but are principled, have a value system the same as yours, but reach different conclusions. And so one of the things that I learned early on as a young senator was it's always appropriate to question another woman or man's judgment. It's never appropriate to question their motive, because you don't know their motive. You can assume a motive. When I first got to the Senate, I didn't want to go because my wife and daughter had just been killed after I was elected, and my 2 boys weren't expected to live. A tractor trailer broadsided them while they were Christmas shopping on December 18th. And so a number of senior senators in both parties came to me and said, please come for 6 months, help us organize, etc. And I thought that they needed me for that reason. So I'm the first senator I ever knew. So I said, okay, and I'll stay for 6 months. Well, I had a Democratic governor got elected. They would have appointed another Democrat. It wouldn't have had any impact on the balance in the Senate. But I went, and I used to have to show up at the majority leader's office, Senator Mansfield, a man of great integrity, once a week to get an assignment. Well, no senators or congressmen get assignments. Nobody assigns a senator anything. But like I said, I'm the first one I ever knew, and I didn't know that. And so I'd show up and dutifully, and it took me about 5 weeks to realize that he was just taking my pulse to see how I was doing emotionally. Because after the last vote, I'd get in the train and immediately come home because my boys were still recuperating. And I remember one day walking in the end of May, and Jesse Helms from North Carolina, who was a very, very tough guy and a bit of a racist. No, for real. I mean, he made no bones about it. It was like when I first got there, they're a bunch of racists. You know, there was, James O. East of Mississippi, Strom Thurmond, and so on. There were 9 guys who were in the caucus that were, I ran against in the civil rights movement. But at any rate, Jesse Helms was excoriating 2 close friends of mine, later became close friends, Bob Dole, the Republican leader, and Teddy Kennedy, for introducing the Americans with Disabilities Act and the precursor to it. And he was saying it's confiscatory. No, government has a right to tell someone they have to have a curb cut to let someone get into their business. No one has a right to da-da-da. And I thought it was heartless. So I went into my meeting. I didn't engage in I walked through the floor to get to my meeting. And I sat down. I guess I looked upset. And the leader looked at me and said, "What's the matter, Joe?" And I went on for 2-3 minutes excoriating Jesse Helms, saying he had no social redeeming value. How could he be so heartless? How could he not care about people? And I learned a lesson. He said, "What would you say, Joe, if I told you that in December of 1968-9, Dot and Jesse Helms were sitting in their home in Raleigh reading the Raleigh Observer, and there was a picture of a young boy, 14 years old, in braces from his ankles up under his arms with 2 steel crutches, looking out and saying, 'All I want for Christmas is someone to love me and take me home.'" He said, "What would you say, Joe, if I told you Jesse and Dot Helms adopted that young man as their own son?" I said, "I'd feel like a fool." He said, "Well, Joe, Jesse Helms, has the wrong position. But you can't judge his motive because you don't know. You don't know." So part of it is trying to understand what it is on a particular issue that someone is espousing, how you get to them, how you can make a case. But on broad strokes, the things you can't overlook, in my view, is you can't overlook global warming. You can't overlook racism. You can't overlook the xenophobia that exists in this country. You can't overlook those things that are basic American values, the things that are the guardrails that have been set up to make this system function the way it does. You can disagree on a whole range of issues, but I don't think you should overlook things that are antithetical to who we are as Americans, what constitutes who we are.
Great. I'm going to just stand. You can stand because I know you want to. I'm happy to stand. We've been sitting a lot, but I want to get through. Thank you. Thank you very much. The next question is from Julia Park, a student. Julia, are you here? Somebody will...
Right there,
Julia.
white sweater.
What year are you? You're a freshman. Terrific. This is a terrific follow-up question, actually. How do we teach and encourage students to civilly discuss and listen to opposing views rather than avoiding talking about politics at all, as a whole?
Well, I've found, Julie, that I've had an opportunity to meet an awful lot of successful people in all political persuasions. And not all of them are happy. But the ones that are both happy and successful, they all have similar traits. And one of them is that they are willing to engage people with different points of view and actually listen, try to figure out what it is that motivates them, what it is that makes them reach the conclusions they have reached, and also not engaging in rationalizing. But one of the things that the adults in this room, the older people, you're all adults, but older people in this room can tell you, is never underestimate the ability of the human mind to rationalize. You know, I know it's her last game, her senior year in high school, but, you know, if I come back for the game, I'll have to take the red eye. She'll understand. No, she won't. No, she won't. She'll say she understands, but she'll never forget. Or, you know, I'm planning this family vacation for a long, long time, but, you know, I have this great business opportunity. If I just take advantage of it now, just take advantage of it now. I ask all of you who are closer to my age how many times you've made judgments like that and whether you regret having made them. Regret having made them. So don't rationalize. Don't rationalize about whether or not it matters to the people you care most about. The other thing I find that they all have in common is that they, in fact, are willing to actually reach out and listen. Listen to the other side. Have an open mind. It's really hard. It's not easy. It's not easy. And that requires you to have thought through with some precision why you hold the view you have. And yours is not based on some prejudice. That yours is based on a rationale that makes a difference. And they're all things that I think matter in terms of how you proceed and how you proceed in your own careers and what you do with your careers. And most importantly, I'd suggest that, you know, follow what you love. Don't let other people define what constitutes success for you. It matters. It matters if you're doing something. You know, there's an expression my dad uses. He says, the lucky person gets up in the morning, puts both feet in the floor, knows what they're about to do, and thinks it still matters. Think of all those of you who are above 50. Think of all the people you know who are extremely successful and no longer think what they do really matters. It's a hell of a place to be. Hell of a place to be. Do what matters to you.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead. Again, Echo Zeng. There. Do I have it right, Echo? Great. Penn design student. What is the role of American higher education in educating and preparing our future diplomats and public policy leaders? What's the role that we play or should play?
If you don't know where we came from, it's hard to understand where you're going. Number one. Number two, it matters that you understand the system, just basic civics. We don't teach basic civics much in high school and college anymore. It really matters. Because the thing that allows us to be so incredible are the political institutions we have erected in order to prevent the abuse of power and provide for opportunity and significant opportunity. But so, you know, things like, you know, we hold these truths self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their creator. That's not just hortatory. We've never met it, but we mean it. We mean it. And we set up institutions to prevent the abuse of power, so we separated power. Well, if you don't understand that, you don't understand why it's so dangerous, some of the things that are happening now. And how democracy is not a guarantee. There's no guarantee. You know, we Americans, we think we're now the oldest democracy in our view. Well, we think it's inevitable. There's nothing inevitable about it. You're seeing it right now. There's a new book out called On Tyranny. Read it, by serious people. Or, you know, How Democracies Fall. Every one of them has fallen in the last 100 years by popular elections. Popular elections. And then people get in and cut down the safeguards. We divide power for a simple reason. We don't trust the concentration of power and the abuse of power. So it's important you understand, people understand. And it's amazing, all the data, I will not, in the interest of time, go through some of the studies, but how little educated people know about their government, how it functions. Basic questions that get asked today. We don't teach civics in school anymore, in high school. We do some, but we don't have, everybody used to have problems of democracy, and you used to have shop, too, by the way, to learn whether you like, by the way. It's incredibly important when you look at how we reform our education system. There are millions of people who learn that they are good working with their hands and provide enormous opportunity for everybody else and for themselves.
The design student would particularly appreciate that.
By the way, seriously, you guys are in the forefront of the amazing change that's going to have to take place. Think about it, guys. Of all the requirements in high school for science, you realize if you take coding, it doesn't qualify in 95% of the high schools in America? When we were bringing Detroit back off its knees, not a joke, the president put me in charge of bringing Detroit back. For real, gave me the authority to do whatever I needed to do with Detroit working as they came out of bankruptcy. Finding all the agencies available that had leftover money that they were able to take advantage of and put it together. And one of the things we found out in Detroit was the exodus was overwhelming of people leaving the city, black and white, middle class. So when they got back off their knees and they're out of bankruptcy, they didn't know how to turn on the street lights, the water system, because it took the ability to code and have faculty to deal with this modern world. So we hired an outfit that you'd go to if you wanted to hire a tech person. They came in and they went into a community college, trained up 54 people. They got them out of the hood. They happened to coincidentally all be women, 23 to 54. Taught them coding, 19-week or 16-week program. I went back for their graduation. Everyone had a job, lowest starting salary, $48,000, highest, $102,000. That was the one exception. And guess what? Every one of them had no more than a high school degree, and 35% only had a GED. Don't underestimate the ability of the American people given a chance, what they're capable of doing. Right. So you design students are doing a lot more in terms of cities, rails.
So I'd love to get through two more questions before we conclude this wonderful discussion. One is by Cesar Ruiz de Castilla. Cesar, are you here? Cesar? Cesar is an engineering student, and here's Cesar's question. Could the West have dealt better with globalization? If so, is the solution now to turn inward or to engage more globally or some combination of both?
Yes, no, and the combination of both. Let me explain. Yes, we could have done much better. And some actually cautioned about doing better. Globalization has lifted literally hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. Hundreds of millions. But it's left entire societies behind, segments of society behind. And it has caused this incredible dislocation that results in economic chaos and or political turmoil as a consequence of it. So instead of us realizing what we were doing, for example, how many of you think 12 years of education is enough to compete in the 21st century? Raise your hand. Not a joke.
No hand.
Now, you don't all need a college degree or a PhD, but one of the studies I did for the president, he used to love at the State of the Union, and now he'd never tell me what he was going to assign me. He thought it was a big joke. He thought it was real fun. Joe's going to do a study on jobs of the 21st century, jobs of the future. So I spent a year doing it with a lot of really bright people. And the result was at least 6 in 10 jobs by 18 require something more than a high school degree. And by the middle of the 21st century, a significantly higher number will require more. It doesn't mean it requires a college degree, but more than a high school degree. And so what's happened is that we didn't pay much attention to that. We didn't focus on that, number one. So we didn't spend any time looking at the dislocation that would occur as a consequence of globalization. A lot of communities were left behind. And we just dealt with it like laissez-faire. Well, that's the way it is. It's going to always come out in the wash like it has in the past. But the changes were fundamental changes that were taking place. So all of a sudden you had, everyone deciding, for example, Google or, the cell phone companies, they make all their product abroad. The greatest advantage we have is we have more great research universities, including this research university, in the United States than all the rest of the world combined. That's not hyperbole. Google it. Literally. Than all the rest of the world combined. And every major life-altering, societal-changing invention has come out of a research university. It has not come out of a corporation. It has not come out of that basic research. It's come out of research universities. Now, the great part about corporate America, they're able to monetize it. They're able to take it and make it a product for the world to have. And so instead of us focusing on how we deal with the dislocation that's taking place, we didn't pay much attention. So, for example, retraining people. One of the things we did, we got rid of over 40 retraining programs that were obsolete. But there's a lot that are not obsolete to put people in a position where they can compete for the jobs of the future. And so whole communities don't atrophy. There's a way to do this. There's a lot of other things that can be done. But it's not to step away from global competition. It's not to step away from globalization. It's to go in and change the rules of the road, which I thought we were well on our way to doing until, anyway, I thought we were on our way to doing. But you had in both parties, on the extreme left and extreme right, decide to move away from globalization. It can be harnessed. We can compete with anybody in the world. When we were doing the major initiative that was going to be the Pacific Partnership we were putting together, TTP and the rest, I had a 5-hour meeting with Xi Jinping in China, in Beijing, at his request, with my team and his team. And after it was all over, he said to an interpreter as we're walking out, he said, "If you get this done, can we join?" It matters that we're as enlightened as our fathers and mothers were, and grandfathers and mothers were, in setting out the rules of the road for competition. Where there's genuine competition. And so stealing intellectual property and the like cannot be tolerated. It must be responded to. But we can compete with anybody. But we've got to change our mindset, which is in the process of having both Republicans and Democrats, to be able to compete better. And a big chunk of it is relating to integrating these changes into American society at great universities like this, as well as moving in the direction of providing people opportunity. Like I said, it's never a good bet to bet against the American people. Given half a chance, they've never, ever let their country down. Never.
Here. Good. Thank you. Thanks, Cesar. Final question. Mila or Mila Tan? Here?
There she
right
is.
There. Mila or Mila? Mila. Micah. Okay. Sorry, it's not your handwriting, but thank you, Micah.
Micah, you can call me Bidden.
Okay. Penn dental student. This is a great question. This is a great question to end on, because I know and I believe, and I know you believe, Mr. Vice President, that it all comes down to people in the end. What do you think will happen to all the dreamers?
I can tell you what I think should happen. I think it eventually will happen, God willing. And I think it's a reflection of the openness and attitude and the decency of the American people. Work myself backwards from those 3 points. The overwhelming majority of the American people think there's plenty of room to integrate these dreamers into American society. It's not like you're able to, when you're 2 years old, being taken across the Rio Grande and say, you know, Mommy, I think this is illegal. You ought to leave me behind. I don't think I should come. The vast majority of these kids, and now grown up, have been honorable citizens, done well in our education system, have done well in our society, and have already become more American than many Americans by adopting the basic fundamental truths of what we believe to be the essence of what America is, number one. But number two, they have been used as a political football and a political tool in a way that I find it to be somewhat disturbing. Lee Kuan Yew was a leader of Singapore and one of the guys who was referred to as the Henry Kissinger of Asia. He wrote extensively on the future of India, Russia, the United States, and China, and made predictions about it. And when I was in Mumbai, I guess in probably 2013 or 14, I got a call. Would I stop on my way to North Korea South Korea, and then to Beijing to meet with him? And most every world leader of any consequence has taken the time to actually meet with him. He was 92 years old at the time, was dying. He died not much later. And this was at the time that aircraft went down the Indian Ocean, never found the black box, you know. And he wanted to talk to me because I had spent more time with Xi Jinping than any world leader had, because President Hu and President Obama decided we should get to know each other since he was going to be the heir apparent. And he would joke with me, he said, all politics is personal, get to know him. And it wouldn't have been appropriate for the president to spend all that time with him while President Hu was alive. And so I spent an awful lot of time with him and traveled tens of thousands of miles with him in China and in the United States. And so I stopped to meet with the former president, and we sat in his home. And he was, as my mother would say, he was still sharp as a tack. He was, I think, 92. He died about 10 months later, if my memory serves me correctly. And he had a Mandarin jacket on, very colorful, and sitting in a Ming Dynasty kind of chair, the square chair, and he had a piece of silk holding him up so he would be straight in the chair. And we were talking about, he wanted to know about what did I think of Xi Jinping, what did I think was happening, etc. And so about 10, 15 minutes into the conversation, I looked at him and I said to him, I said, Mr. President, what's China doing now? And this is, I swear to God, literally and precisely what he said to me. He said, China is in America looking for the buried black box. And I looked at him like, you're looking at me. And I said, I apologize, Mr. President, I don't know what you mean. He said, they're looking for the secrets that have allowed America to be the only country in the history of the world ever able to constantly remake itself. Constantly able to remake itself. And I said, Mr. President, I'm old enough now to venture a guess if they find that black box, what they'll find in it. They'll find two things. One, no child, no matter how poor the school they go to and grade school on, is ever criticized for challenging orthodoxy. Unlike any other country in the world, including our European friends, we do not worship at the shrine of orthodoxy. That's why we're able to break old things to make new things. I mean, literally. Not figuratively, literally. And I said the second thing they'll find in that black box is a constant, unrelenting wave of immigration, in waves, beginning in the mid-1700s, met occasionally by periods of xenophobia that last from a couple years to a decade, but always overcome. And he looked at me and he said, why is that important? And I said, because it's allowed us to cherry pick from every culture in the world, every culture, the best of every culture. Think of what it takes for your ancestors, wherever they came from, whenever they came. The courage it took to get on a boat, mostly in every instance. In my case of my great-great-grandfather, leaving from the Cooley Peninsula in a coffin ship to come to the United States in the middle of the end of a famine in Ireland. It wasn't like, God, isn't this going to be fun? Let's go. The people who left were the people who were basically optimistic, determined, resolved, committed. We've gotten the best of every culture. That's what makes us the most unique nation in the world. China, Japan, most other countries are xenophobic. But in the United States of America, that's what's allowed us to have this incredible mix of cultures and capacities, sharing several basic tenets. We can do anything. Not a joke. Not a joke. We can do anything. It's the nature of the character of the people who built this country, in my view. Not unique to any one culture, but it's amazing. Most of you and almost all of your parents were raised to believe there's not a damn thing we can't do in America. I know this sounds silly, but one of the reasons I started the cancer initiative I did, the Biden Cancer Initiative, was I was convinced if we prove, which we will do, and they're doing it right here at Penn, that we can change the face of cancer in the next decade, people will believe again we can do anything. And we can. We can. So, folks, look, that's who we are, but we've kind of forgotten who we are. Democrats and Republicans. We walk around like, oh, woe is me. We have so many. No, I really mean it. Think about the dialogue. Oh, my God, we're in trouble. Oh, we have these problems. Oh, how are we going to commit? What are we going to do? Jesus, God. Guys, it's time to get up. Get off our knees. Get up. Remember who the hell we are. This is the United States of America. There's nothing we've ever not been able to do. Not a joke. I have never been more optimistic about America's chances to lead the 21st century than I am today, and I got there when I was a 29-year-old idealist, as I was referred to. I'm more optimistic today. Think about it. Like I said, we've got the greatest research universities in the world. We're the most agile venture capitalists in the world. We're in a position where we have the most productive workers in the world. Not hyperbole, fact. The most productive workers in the world. We're in a situation in the United States of America where we're the wealthiest, most powerful nation in the history of the world. I moved to Delaware, a little steel town. It's no longer steel. Claymont, Delaware, not far south there, just over the border. We used to have an expression. I will not use the exact one. The rest of the world is not a patch on our genes. China's a great country. My God, you want China's problems? They have opportunities. You want their problems? Do you think they can sustain an autocracy as incomes grow? Do you think they're going to be able to settle the historic division between the seacoast and the West? What do you think? Name me another country that has the capacity and the ability to do what we can do. So, guys, if I leave you with one thing, all kidding aside, don't forget who the hell we are. It's because we are so diverse. It's because we have such an ethic that existed. It's because we believed. We're not afraid to try anything. We're not afraid. We're not afraid. We can do anything. Thank you.
We can. Please join me in thanking. I thank you all for being here, for great questions, for great audience. Let us once again thank the 47th Vice President of the United States.